Welcome to the first episode of the Morris Minute-ish podcast, where we explore the legendary people, places, and events that made Alabama the heart of Dixie. And I'm your host, Coach Kyle Morris. Welcome. The first Morris Minute-ish podcast. Wow, I don't know what brought you here, but I'm glad you came. Where this comes from is my Morris Minute-ish post on Facebook and Instagram started getting lots of love, and people said they enjoyed it. So I figured let's take off and do something that's a little bit longer because those limit me to 90 seconds. So there were some cool stories and things that I could dig into that I couldn't really get into in 90 seconds. And as most of my students know, it's hard to hold me into a 90-second interview. So this was started as a way to give the longer form. Now, we're only going to go, maybe top 15 minutes. Most of them will be 5 to 10 minutes on a subject and get some cool stories and provide you with the Alabama history and people and events that you all know and love. So, when deciding who to do on this first episode, I thought about doing somebody famous that everyone knows a little bit about and get deeper into it. Jimmy Buffett, Kenny Stabler, people like that. Then I began to think, well, what if we did something like, I don't know, a great battle, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, or maybe we could talk about the history of Muscle Shoals. And there's going to be times for all of those. But I thought this first one needed to be special. So it needs to tell a great story, but needs to be somebody that you probably don't have a lot of familiarity with. So today's story, we're going to look into the riverboat captain, Simp McGee. Now, there's a lot of controversy on whether he was born to wealthy parents or an orphan. Now, that's the kind of story you want when a guy could either be of wealthy origin or an orphan. A lot of room in between on those. So as he grew up in the Civil War and post-Civil War Reconstruction era, he decided at 13 years old in 1872, he was going to go work on the Tennessee River navigation. So he began working for a company running ships from Chattanooga to Decatur. And he worked his way up and eventually came to run one of the ships himself. He ran actually a few different ships. One of them was called the Chattanooga. And in doing these runs, remember, this is before we had the dam system that the TVA put in place. So it was much more precarious than you think now. The route he ran would be present day Nickajack Lake, down into Gunnersville, over into Wheeler, and he'd come into dock there in Decatur. So this was something that if you looked at today doesn't seem very treacherous. But in the time before we had the dam system in place, there were some very shallow runs. And one of those was in the area around Chattanooga known as the Chute. And without getting too deep into maritime law, the Chute was a very shallow, narrow channel that you had to stay in, and you didn't have GPS navigation or anything. The buoys weren't near as good as they are now, so you really had to know how to navigate it. So the best way to put it in modern terms is it was kind of like a no-wake zone. All the ships had to go through very carefully and obviously slowing it down. So slowing it down cost a ship captain money. So Simp, he would shoot the chute, S-H-O-O-T, the C-H-U-T-E. So by doing that, he'd pass through it at full speed. Very dangerous, very illegal, and very, a little bit cavalier. And then he would come into town in Decatur, blowing his horn on Thursday. The reason he would come in blowing the horn on Thursdays was he had to go see his lady friend, Miss Kate. And Miss Kate had a one of those establishments where you could buy the attention of a young lady for a little while. Yep, Miss Kate was a madam, and she ran a brothel there in Decatur. But on Thursdays, when Simp would come into town and blow the horn on the ship, the brothel shut down, and Miss Kate had Simp McGee in town to party. And boy, did Simp have some fun. If you're familiar with the Decatur area, there's a street right off of the river known as Bank Street. It has a lot of old buildings, and in this time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a few drinking establishments along that area. And Miss Kate and Simp were known to frequent those a little bit. But when Miss Kate wasn't available, he had to have another drinking companion. And Simp had a quote where he said, "Be careful who you drink with. Most men are not trustworthy drinkers." So he had a pig. Yep, Simp had a pig. And he would take the pig into the bars, sit him on the bar stool next to Simp, and order him a mug of beer. And Simp would drink his beer, and the pig would drink their beers, and put the leash on the pig, and they'd go down back to the ship, back up to Chattanooga. I mean, what a great picture of a crazy, wild era in Alabama history. Riverboat captains come into town, blowing the horn to shut down the brothel, going to visit the madam, and then taking his pig to the bars for the night. Simp really was a larger-than-life character. But, as Simp once said, "My daddy is a gambling man, my mama was the Tennessee River. I'm too mean for dry land, too gentle for the river. But when I die, there's going to be hell to pay, because hell ain't big enough for both the devil and Simp McGee." Well, in 1917, I guess it was time for Simp to find out, because authorities finally caught up to Simp shooting the chute and pulled his license. And for a guy who had made his living running the river since he was 13 years old, it was all he had ever known, being grounded on dry land was never something that Simp was going to be okay with. So in 1917, about 3 months after his license was pulled, Simp died at Miss Kate's brothel. When you start talking about somebody of Simp's stature and who he was and what he brought to this area, it's full of stories that are unsubstantiated, and sometimes it's a little bit more than you can believe. But when we come back, we're going to have a few stories about Simp that are just too good to leave out. Welcome back. We're here for the final segment of the first episode of the Morris Minute-ish podcast. And while I was talking about Simp McGee's brothel-owning lover, Kate, I felt like we need to know a little bit more about this woman and why Simp McGee is still larger than life. Because she wasn't always a brothel owner. In fact, Catherine Lackner was married. She had a few children and a husband and everything that most women of the time wanted. She was busy in the community, had the picture-perfect life. But one day, she met William Simpson McGhee, and he hired her to run the brothel. Yes, Miss Kate's brothel was owned by Simp McGee. And when she was brought in to run it, she fell in love with Simp. Left her husband, left her kids, and became Simp's lover and the runner of his brothel. This guy really, really lived a wild life. But we're going to wrap it up with a few things to remember the great Simp McGee. And number one is there's a restaurant on Bank Street in Decatur named in his honor. If you ever get a chance to visit, it's a great place. I ate there a couple weeks ago and had the Pontchartrain, which was just excellent. It's Cajun seafood. It's right there on Bank Street in Decatur. It opens, I think, 5 o'clock every day, but you'd have to go by and see them. It's not a paid advertisement unless they want to, send some gift cards this way, which I would gladly take. But Simp's life is kind of brought up in a few different things. But if you want to learn more about him, there's a book called The Story of Decatur, Alabama, written by William Jenkins and John Knox, and you can read about him there. But I'm going to wrap up this first podcast, and I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen. If you have any ideas or anything for this thing you think I should do different, things that might be good moving forward, if you would, leave a comment or send me a message. I'll be glad to include it. And I want to thank everyone one more time for taking the time to listen. We'll be back next week with another Morris Minute-ish podcast.